All of the Kremlin's defense systems have collapsed. Moscow is trembling with shock at the Ukrainian drones approaching like a sinister shadow from thousands of kilometers away. And this is fundamentally changing not only Russia's but the world's perception of security. With NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's shocking observation, Vladimir Putin's Russia is running out of money, military strength, and ideas. The war in Ukraine is literally eating away at Russia from within. The most concrete evidence of this claim was the unbelievable scene at the front. This is not just a diplomatic claim. It is a bitter truth, confirmed by a horrific scene from the Telegraph, proving how desperate Russia is. The discovery of special Russian units around Pokrovsk, consisting of soldiers infected with HIV, hepatitis, and other deadly diseases, showed that the Russian army's morale and human resources had hit rock bottom. These soldiers, wearing special armbands indicating the threat they carried, were being used to create psychological pressure on Ukrainian defenders. If Moscow is forced to send soldiers carrying diseases to their deaths to maintain its operational tempo, this means that the army is literally advancing with empty reserves. This situation is not just a regional desperation in Pokrovsk, but only part of a much larger story that tells of the collapse of Russia's entire war structure. Russia's failure stems from a series of structural flaws, ranging from the Kremlin's flawed intelligence to its rotten military doctrine and rapidly collapsing economy. So why was Russia so unprepared for modern warfare? And how is Europe responding to this collapse with a historic alliance? Russia's staggering losses on the front lines and the inhumane desperation around Pokrovsk stem from a fatal planning error at the war's outset. The invasion was managed not by military command, but directly by Putin's security service, the FSB. Putin's expectation was to seize Ukraine within 10 days, and this was a special military operation, based on the assumption that Russia would be welcomed with open arms, rather than a conventional attack. This political blindness was fueled by the delusion that the Crimea annexation strategy could be repeated. However, after the annexation of Crimea, national consciousness and hatred of Russia had peaked in Ukraine. This delusion was accompanied by paralysis in military doctrine. As the IFRI report emphasized, Russia's last large-scale war was during the Soviet era, and the swift victory in Georgia in 2008 had completely depleted Russia's mobilization and logistical channels. The resulting structure was a military organization dependent on imaginary strategic thinking with no contingency plan, which resulted in a concrete fiasco at Hostomel airport in the first hours of the war. The Hostomel airport operation was the only large-scale and ambitious part of Russia's plan to capture Kiev. The plan was to seize the airport and march on the capital by airlifting thousands of reinforcements. However, the operation was a complete disaster. When Russia sent around 300 Special Forces soldiers in 34 helicopters, they were met by Ukraine's prepared defenses, and 5 Russian helicopters were shot down, stalling the attack. The key to this failure was intelligence. Thanks to CIA Director William Burns personally informing Zelensky about the invasion plan, Ukraine had filled the airport with scrap vehicles, making it impossible for transport planes to land. Faced with initial resistance, Russia was forced to withdraw 18 Il-76 transport planes full of reinforcements, an incident that exposed deep weaknesses in the Russian command structure. The Russian army had a rigid structure, operating on orders from the highest levels. Lower-ranking officers lacked the ability to make tactical decisions on the fly, and most importantly, unlike Ukrainian forces, who could improvise thanks to NATO training, Russia could not break free from its predictability. This was why Russia couldn't even secure air superiority. Its rigid, hierarchical structure and lack of accurate intelligence prevented the army from adapting to modern warfare. Meanwhile, the root of Russia's military and doctrinal problems lies in Putin's creation of an echo chamber over the past 20 years, blocking the flow of accurate information and dissenting views to himself. This led to catastrophic intelligence failures because the data collected by Russian intelligence was carefully filtered to support Putin's beliefs. Western intelligence, however, was fully aware of the situation and shared this information with Ukraine, giving it a vital advantage. The system Putin has created goes beyond just poor battlefield intelligence, forcing Russia to implement orders that run counter to its long-term interests. This is because admitting the system's failure would mean admitting that the initial assessment was wrong, which is something Putin cannot tolerate. This creates a dangerous instability within the regime itself, because if the war drags on and economic conditions deteriorate, That critical circle of security services and oligarchs may come to believe that Putin no longer serves their interests, and in that case, the regime could fracture from within. This is a historical irony. A system that eliminates opposition to control the regime is preventing the adaptation necessary for its own survival. Along with all this, Russia's structural problems on the front lines and within its political system are being stifled by the country's economy. The war has plunged the Russian economy into an irreversible death spiral, and defense spending in 2025 is expected to exceed a record 8% of GDP. To finance these expenditures, Putin has continuously raised corporate and personal taxes and was even forced to make military cuts in the 2026 budget, as the oil and gas industry, which accounted for 50% of pre-war revenues, has stalled. China and India have established a duopoly over Russia by purchasing Russian crude oil at very low prices, and according to the Jamestown report, arms exports have collapsed by 92%. This means that the billions of dollars in revenue expected from allies have almost completely disappeared. This economic pressure has forced Russia to create an economic model that can only survive through continued war. Peace would immediately expose these economic and demographic problems. However, the continuation of the war means higher taxes for the people and fewer jobs in other sectors. With each turn of this spiral, Russia tightens the noose around its own future. As Russia's internal collapse accelerates, a historic shift is taking place on the international front. Contrary to Putin's expectations of fragmentation, Europe is rising as the cornerstone of Ukraine's resistance and permanently reshaping the geopolitical balance. The Coalition of the Willing, initiated by France and the UK, has pledged at least 40 billion euros in military support to Ukraine by 2025, even in the absence of the US. This means that Europe is rapidly cutting its historic dependence on Russian gas, strangling Moscow's economic lifeline. Direct support for Ukraine from countries like Denmark and Romania has prevented the fragmentation of Europe that Russia had hoped for, and the EU has begun to seriously consider establishing a permanent army on par with the US in terms of military spending and preparedness. However, more dangerous than this external pressure is the internal violence spreading within Russia, with soldiers returning home from the front. 1/5 of returning veterans suffer from PTSD, and these veterans have killed or injured more than 750 people within Russia. Furthermore, the fact that at least 50,000 soldiers have deserted, meaning they chose to surrender to the enemy or go to prison rather than serve their own country, shows the ultimate collapse of military morale. The government has created a military caste that can only sustain its standard of living through war service by promising high military salaries, and this is a vicious cycle that means more war and more recruitment. The narrow security circle and oligarchy around Putin are increasingly at risk as the regime enters this death spiral. The regime has completely eliminated the opposition in order to maintain control. However, this situation, on the contrary, increases the risk of collapse from within. Putin's system relies on only a few hundred key individuals. Currently, the pressure on these people may keep them loyal to the Kremlin, but as the war drags on and economic conditions become unbearable, these key figures will begin to fear for their own security or long-term interests. That is when the entire structure could crack. For if these people begin to believe that Putin no longer serves their interests, the system itself may turn to oust Putin or bring in a new leader who will present a more acceptable face to the West. This is the system's self-destruct mechanism, which prevents the adaptation necessary for the regime to survive. Even China's careful setting of limits on its unlimited friendship with Russia and its avoidance of risking Western sanctions confirms this internal fragility. As Moscow becomes increasingly isolated on the international stage, even China, its economic hope, is carefully monitoring Russia's instability and limiting its military support, revealing how fragile the Kremlin's last cards actually are. All these structural problems and internal pressures are dragging Russia's national security into chaos, not only on the front lines, but also within its own borders. The drones infiltrating Moscow and the storm shadow strikes in Bryansk clearly exposed the massive gaps in the country's defense architecture. Security vulnerabilities have even led to desperate censorship measures that paralyze civilian life, such as shutting down the internet in remote regions like Arkhangelsk. This situation demonstrates how helpless the Russian government is not only in the face of military defeat, but also in controlling the flow of information and panic among the population. The cost of the war is now not only economic, but also social. The violent acts of PTSD-suffering veterans returning to Russia and the security chaos created by tens of thousands of deserting soldiers are increasingly undermining the regime's internal stability. The artificial, military caste Putin created to sustain the war has created a vicious cycle. Dependent on their salaries, these soldiers cannot adapt to civilian life, forcing further recruitment and fueling the war. With each turn of this spiral, Russia deepens the war not only against Ukraine, but also against itself. At this point, the words of the NATO Secretary General, the HIV-positive soldiers in Pokrovsk, the FSB's intelligence disaster, and the death spiral of the Russian economy all point to one truth: Russia's war machine is being defeated not only by Ukraine's resistance, but also by its own structural and fatal flaws. Ukraine's tactical successes are a direct reflection of Russia's doctrinal and intelligence failures, and Europe's historic unity and the internal collapse of the Russian economy are shaking the foundations on which Putin's regime rests. The economic crisis, mass desertions, and the internal violence created by returning veterans are fatal illnesses shortening the regime's lifespan. And even if Russia wins a Pyrrhic victory at the end of this cycle, it will not save it from the consequences of this collapse. So, how much longer do you think Putin's regime can survive in the face of these internal and external pressures? And how would a regime change in Russia alter the course of the war? Don't forget to share your comments and express your views with us. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our videos for more in-depth analysis. See you in the next critical analysis.